I thought I had just bought a cheap cabin, but now an Apache woman in the basement says John had been searching for months for a place far away from the noise of the city. He had grown tired of traffic, crowded streets, and the constant rush of life that never seemed to stop. He wanted a quiet place where he could think, relax, and maybe even write a few stories he had been putting off for years. When he first saw the listing for the cabin, he almost couldn't believe his eyes. It was small, old, and a little run down, but the price was far lower than anything else he had seen. The photos online showed a wooden cabin surrounded by tall pine trees. The roof looked a little crooked, and the paint had peeled in some areas, but it had charm. A small porch led up to the front door, and smoke seemed to rise from a chimney, even in the photograph. There was a sense of peace in the image that pulled John in. Without thinking too much, he called the agent and arranged to see it in person. When he arrived, the sun was just beginning to rise over the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin was exactly as it had appeared in the photos, maybe even better in real life. The smell of the forest mixed with the faint scent of wood smoke made him feel calm for the first time in months. As he stepped onto the porch, he felt a strange sense of excitement. He imagined himself sitting there with a cup of coffee, listening to the birds and the wind through the trees. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. The living room had a fireplace with old bricks, a few shelves built into the walls, and wooden floors that creaked slightly when he walked. The kitchen was basic, with old cabinets and a small sink, but it felt charming rather than inconvenient. There was a bedroom with a simple bed and a small bathroom. A narrow staircase led down to the basement, which John noticed right away. He wondered what could be down there, but told himself he would check later. For now, he was just happy. Buying the cabin turned out to be easier than John expected. The paperwork was simple, and the price was exactly as advertised. He left the city with a small truck full of his belongings, excited for the life he was about to start. Driving down the winding road to the cabin, he felt a mix of nervousness and anticipation. It was one thing to imagine a peaceful life. It was another to finally arrive. The first few days were everything John had hoped for. He unpacked his things, swept the floors, and even built a small fire in the fireplace. One evening, the nights were quiet, with only the sound of wind and trees rustling. He could hear distant birds, the occasional deer walking nearby, and sometimes a soft owl hooting in the distance. It felt like a dream. But as the first week passed, John began to notice small things that made him uneasy. A window would be slightly open when he knew he had closed it. The sound of footsteps in the attic or basement would wake him in the night, even though he was alone. Sometimes he thought he heard whispering, but whenever he followed the sound, there was nothing there, besides his imagination. After all, it was an old cabin, and old houses always had strange noises. Psst. One evening, while unpacking some boxes in the living room, John noticed a small scratch on the wall near the staircase to the basement. It looked like someone had carved a symbol, a strange pattern that didn't make sense to him. He crouched down to examine it closer. It seemed old, and the wood around it had darkened over time, but chill ran down his spine, but he shook it off. He told himself it was probably just a decoration from the previous owner, maybe some kind of mark or initials. Curiosity got the better of him, and the next morning he decided to go down to the basement. The stairs creaked under his weight, and a cold draft hit him as he opened the door. The basement was dark, with only a few small windows that let in slivers of light. Dust covered the floor, and old furniture was stacked against the walls. It smelled musty, but there was something else, something faint and strange that he couldn't identify. As he explored, he noticed more symbols scratched into the walls, similar to the one he had seen near the staircase. They were small, intricate, and unlike anything he had seen before. He ran his fingers over the carvings, feeling the rough texture of the wood. Just as he was about to leave, he heard it, a soft voice, almost a whisper, coming from the far corner of the basement. John froze. "Hello!" he called, his voice trembling slightly. There was no reply, only silence. He took a step forward, and the voice spoke again, a little clearer this time. "Please, help me." John's heart pounded in his chest. He turned on his flashlight and shone it toward the corner. There, sitting on the cold concrete floor, was a woman. Her hair was dark and long, and she had a calm but sad expression. Her clothing was simple, and her eyes seemed to hold stories of pain and endurance. She looked at John, and he could feel the weight of her gaze. I don't understand," John stammered. "Who are you?" "How did you get here?" The woman's voice was soft but steady. "My name is Aiyana. I am Apache. I have been here for a long time. I needed to protect something, and I was trapped. I didn't know when or if anyone would come." John stepped back, unsure what to do. Breaths. Everything in his life had been ordinary until now. But here was a woman claiming to have been trapped in his basement, speaking of ancient protection, and a life he could not even imagine. He wanted to call the police, to say this was impossible, but something in her eyes made him pause. There was no threat, only quiet strength and a deep sadness. He decided to sit on an old chair nearby, careful not to startle her. I don't know what to do," he admitted. "I just bought this cabin." "I didn't know anyone was here." Aiyana nodded. "I know. You are not responsible for what happened. But now that you are here, I need your help. There are things in this place, things that must be protected. I cannot leave until they are safe." John swallowed hard, trying to process her words. The ordinary life he had imagined, quiet mornings, peaceful evenings, was gone. Instead, he was faced with something mysterious, something ancient and important that had been hidden in the basement all this time. That night, he barely slept. He lay in bed listening to the wind outside, thinking about the woman in his basement and the strange carvings on the walls. He wondered who had trapped her, and why, and what exactly needed protection. He felt a mix of fear, curiosity, and responsibility. The cabin was no longer just a cheap getaway. It was now a place filled with mystery and history. The next morning, John brought Aiyana some food and water. She thanked him, her eyes softening as she spoke.
"It is rare to find someone willing to listen," she said.
"Most people would not understand, but you are different."
"You must see what I am trying to protect." Over the next few days, John explored more of the basement under Aiyana's guidance.
He found hidden compartments, old journals, and small artifacts that seemed ordinary but felt important. Each discovery added to the mystery and pulled him deeper into a story that was far larger than his quiet cabin life. The peaceful life he had imagined was gone, replaced by something extraordinary and unexpected. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the cabin, John realized his life had changed forever, but what had seemed like a simple purchase had become an adventure he could never have imagined. And he knew, deep down, that the woman in the basement had not come into his life by accident. From that moment on, John understood that the cabin was more than a home. It was a gateway to history, mystery, and something much greater than himself. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind, and every shadow in the basement held secrets he was only beginning to uncover. John could not stop thinking about the woman in his basement. Every time he walked past the staircase, he felt a mix of fear and curiosity. Was she really? How had she ended up in his cabin? And what exactly was she protecting? He had grown up reading stories of history and culture, but nothing had ever prepared him for something like this. Real, mysterious, and happening in his own home.
Aiyana seemed calm, almost patient, as if she had been waiting for someone like John to come along.
She did not rush him or demand answers. Instead, she began to tell her story slowly, carefully choosing her words. She spoke of her ancestors who had lived on the land long before anyone else. They had cared for the forest, the rivers, and the mountains, treating every tree and animal with respect. Her people had deep knowledge of the land, knowledge that had been passed down through generations. John listened intently, fascinated by the richness of her words. Psst. She described ceremonies, teachings, and a connection to the earth that he had never understood before. She spoke of sacred places hidden in the forest and artifacts that held stories of her people's past. John could feel the weight of her words, and he realized this was more than just a story. It was history, alive and real, living right there in his basement. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned orange, Aiyana took John to a hidden corner of the basement. There, tucked away behind old boxes and furniture, was a small wooden chest. It was simple, carved with patterns similar to the symbols on the walls. John knelt beside it, carefully opening the lid. Inside were objects he could barely recognize: feathers, small carved figures, pieces of cloth, and old papers. Breath. Each item seemed delicate and important. "These are treasures of my people," Aiyana explained softly. "They tell the story of our history, our beliefs, and our connection to this land. They must be protected. People do not understand their value, but they are part of something much larger than themselves." John nodded, feeling a mixture of awe and responsibility. He had thought he was buying a cheap cabin for himself, but now he realized he had stepped into a story that was centuries old. It was overwhelming, but he also felt honored. He wanted to help Aiyana, even though he had no idea how. As the days passed, John learned more about Aiyana's life. She had been living in the basement for months, hiding from people who had wanted to sell the land or take the artifacts for their own gain. She had been careful, moving quietly and avoiding notice, but now she needed help. John offered her food, blankets, and comfort, and slowly she began to trust him more. Together, they explored the basement in detail. John discovered hidden compartments in the walls, small nooks that held papers and objects wrapped carefully in cloth.
Aiyana explained the meaning of some of these items, though many remained a mystery.
She spoke of rituals that honored the earth, the spirits of ancestors, and the importance of keeping the stories alive. John tried to absorb everything she said, realizing that he was learning about a culture he had never known right in his own home. At first, he felt afraid. The thought of strangers finding out about the cabin, or worse, finding Aiyana, made him anxious. But over time, fear was replaced by determination. He knew he could not let her face danger alone. He began to understand the importance of her mission, and he felt proud to be a part of it, even in a small way. One afternoon, John decided to take a walk in the forest around the cabin. Aiyana had warned him that the land itself was sacred and that certain areas were protected. He followed her instructions carefully, stepping lightly on the forest floor and observing the small streams and trees. The forest was alive with sound, the rustle of leaves, birds singing, and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. As he walked, he felt a sense of calm and connection he had never experienced in the city. Aiyana joined him, moving gracefully through the trees. She pointed out certain plants that were used for medicine and others that had symbolic meaning. John listened and watched, realizing that she saw the world in a way he never had. Every detail mattered, and everything had a purpose. He felt lucky to be learning from her, even as he struggled to understand the full depth of her knowledge. Back at the cabin, John began to notice more strange occurrences. At first, they were small. Items in the basement seemed to be slightly moved. Shadows flickered in the corners, and sometimes he heard whispers that made the hair on his neck stand up. Aiyana explained that the land itself was watching, and that sometimes the spirits of ancestors communicated in ways humans might not understand. John was skeptical at first, but could not deny the strange feelings he experienced. One night, while they sat near the fireplace, Aiyana told John more about the dangers she had faced. She explained that some people in the nearby towns had wanted to exploit the land, sell it, or take the artifacts. They did not understand or respect the history of the place, and they had trapped her to make their plans easier. John listened, horrified that someone could do such a thing. He promised her he would help, no matter what it took. Days turned into weeks, and a routine began to form. John learned how to care for the artifacts, how to move quietly in the basement, and how to respect the land around the cabin. Aiyana taught him about her people's traditions, stories of bravery, and the importance of protecting history. John found himself changing. He was no longer just a man seeking peace. He was someone responsible for something far greater than himself. Their bond grew stronger. They spent hours talking about the past, exploring the basement and forest and learning from each other. Aiyana appreciated John's willingness to listen and learn. John admired her courage and strength. He realized that what had started as a simple purchase of a cheap cabin had transformed into an extraordinary experience. One evening, John asked Aiyana about the symbols carved into the walls. She explained that they were protective marks, meant to keep certain spirits safe and to warn those who did not understand the sacredness of the land. John traced the carvings with his fingers, feeling the energy she described. It was unlike anything he had experienced. The symbols were not just art. They were history, protection, and guidance all at once. Aiyana also spoke of the people who had come before, those who had worked to preserve the land and its treasures. She told John that many had tried to forget, many had ignored the importance of the past, but some had fought to protect it. She saw in John the same willingness to listen and protect, even if he did not yet understand the full story. As the first winter approached, the forest outside the cabin transformed. Snow covered the trees and the cold wind blew through the mountains. John and Aiyana prepared the cabin for the season, ensuring that everything was safe and warm. The nights were long and quiet, but they felt peaceful. John would sit near the fireplace, listening to Aiyana's stories, feeling a connection to the past, the land, and something larger than himself. One night, while the snow fell silently outside, John realized he had grown attached to the cabin, not for its simplicity or low price, but for the life it had brought into his world.
He had come seeking peace, but he had found history, mystery, and friendship.
The ordinary life he had imagined was gone, replaced by something extraordinary. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. Protecting the artifacts and the land would require courage, patience, and careful thinking. But he was ready. He had learned that some things in life are worth more than comfort or convenience. He had learned that listening, respecting, and understanding could change everything. And he had learned that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when you least expect them. Like finding a mysterious woman in your basement on the first week of living in a cabin you thought was just cheap and simple. For John, life had changed forever. The cabin was no longer just a building. It was a gateway to something incredible. Every day brought new discoveries, new challenges, and new lessons. And through it all, Aiyana remained a guide, a teacher, and a friend. Together, they were beginning a journey that neither of them could have imagined, a journey that would connect the past and present in ways John had never dreamed of. John had settled into a routine with Aiyana, helping her protect the artifacts and learning about the sacred land around the cabin. Life felt purposeful, though he still missed the simplicity he had originally hoped for. But soon, that peace began to feel fragile.
Strange things started happening that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence.
It began with subtle signs. One morning, John noticed footprints in the fresh snow outside the cabin. They were too large to belong to any of the local animals, and followed a path that circled around the cabin several times before disappearing into the trees. He called out, expecting perhaps to see a neighbor or hiker, but there was no one. Aiyana saw the prints too and frowned. "They have been here," she said quietly. "People who want to take what does not belong to them." John felt a chill run down his spine. He had thought the world outside the forest was distant and uninterested in the cabin. But apparently, someone knew about it, and about Aiyana.
He asked how she knew, and she explained that she had felt signs of people approaching for weeks before.
"The land itself often revealed threats," she said, "but only to those who were listening." John realized he had been ignoring subtle warnings that could have kept them safer. Over the next few days, the strange events intensified. Doors that John knew he had locked were sometimes found ajar. At night, the wind carried faint voices, almost like whispers in a language he could not understand. He found small disturbances in the basement. Boxes slightly moved. Papers shifted as if someone had been looking through them. At first, John thought he might be imagining things, but Aiyana confirmed his fears. "They are watching us," she said. Her voice was calm but serious.
"They do not understand what is here."
"They only want what they can profit from." John felt a mixture of anger and fear. Breaths. How could anyone think of harming her or taking the artifacts? These were sacred items, part of a history he had only just begun to understand. And yet, he realized that this was not a story he could simply walk away from. He had promised to help Aiyana, and now he had to stand by her. That night, as snow fell silently outside, John stayed awake near the window, watching the trees and listening. And just when he thought nothing would happen, he heard a distant sound, the crunch of footsteps in the snow, growing closer. He froze, then grabbed a flashlight and quietly moved toward the basement to alert Aiyana. Breaths. "John!" Aiyana's voice called softly from the corner of the room. She had been kneeling beside the chest of artifacts, quietly rearranging some of the items. John whispered to her, and they both moved silently, making sure the basement door was securely locked. They watched through the small windows in the cabin's front door as shadows moved in the forest outside. Biggest were walking toward the cabin, moving carefully but deliberately. "They are not just curious," Aiyana said. Her eyes were sharp and alert. "They know about the artifacts. They want them."
John felt a surge of fear and responsibility. He had never imagined that buying a cheap cabin would lead to such danger.
The thought of strangers breaking in, taking what did not belong to them, or hurting Aiyana filled him with a mix of panic and determination. He realized that this was no longer a quiet retreat. It was a place that needed defending. For the next several days, John and Aiyana began taking precautions. They secured the cabin as best they could, moving the artifacts to hidden compartments, covering tracks in the snow, and staying alert at all times. Every sound outside made John's heart race. He found himself jumping at the rustle of branches, the snap of twigs, and even the movement of small animals. Aiyana remained calm, guiding him and showing him how to sense danger without fear. One afternoon, while John was checking the perimeter of the cabin, he noticed a figure in the distance. A man standing at the edge of the trees, watching the cabin. John's first instinct was to panic, but he remembered Aiyana's words. Observe. Do not react impulsively. He returned inside and told her. Together they watched the figure silently from the window. The man stayed for a long time, then disappeared into the forest. John realized that this was no ordinary visitor. Someone was testing them, seeing if the cabin was defenseless. The tension grew over the next week. Burrit. Supplies he had left outside disappeared. Strange noises echoed at night, and shadows seemed to move with purpose around the cabin. John could not sleep well, constantly waking at the slightest sound. Aiyana reassured him that the land was protective, but she also emphasized caution. They were not just defending a home. They were guarding history, culture, and something far greater than themselves. John's anxiety was compounded by feelings of guilt. He wondered if he had brought this danger into the cabin simply by buying it. He questioned himself constantly. Had he made the right decision? Was he truly capable of protecting Aiyana and the artifacts? Aiyana, noticing his distress, spoke softly one evening.
"You did not bring this danger," she said.
It has always been here. We only notice it because the land trusts us to protect it.
You are stronger than you realize, John. You just must believe it. Her words gave him a measure of calm, but they did not erase the fear. That fear became real one evening when a loud crash echoed from the front of the cabin. John and Aiyana rushed to the window, hearts pounding, and saw a group of people attempting to break in. They were men carrying tools, trying to force the cabin door open. Don's mind raced. He had never confronted anyone like this before. The thought of being helpless filled him with terror. But Aiyana's calm presence grounded him.
"We protect what is important," she said. "Stay with me." Together, they moved quickly.
Aiyana guided John to lock the basement and hide the most valuable artifacts in a secret compartment he had not known existed. They waited silent as the strangers tried the doors and windows, frustrated by the lack of access. The men eventually left after several tense minutes, muttering angrily, but John's heart continued to pound long after they were gone. The next morning, John realized something important. They could not simply hide and hope the danger would pass. They had to be smart, careful, and prepared for anything. Aiyana explained that the artifacts were not just objects. They were symbols of protection and history. If they were taken, the balance she had been trying to maintain for years could be broken. John felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders.
Over the next few days, John and Aiyana worked together to strengthen the cabin.
They reinforced doors, cleared brush around the property to see approaching figures more easily, and created hidden paths in the forest to move safely if needed.
John learned how to move quietly, listen carefully to sounds in the forest, and anticipate possible threats.
Each day he grew more confident, though the tension never fully disappeared. Despite the danger, John found moments of awe and beauty. The forest remained breathtaking, and the bond between him and Aiyana grew stronger. They shared stories, meals, and quiet moments by the fireplace, reminding themselves why they were fighting to protect the cabin and its secrets. John realized that fear and beauty could coexist, and that courage was not the absence of fear, but action despite it. One night, as the stars shone brightly above the mountains, Aiyana spoke of the long history of her people. She told John of ancestors who had faced threats far greater than theirs and who had persevered through courage, wisdom, and care for the land. John listened, inspired by her strength and determination. He began to see himself not as a passive protector, but as an active part of the story unfolding around the cabin. But days turned into weeks, and though the threat of strangers remained, John grew more confident in his role. He and Aiyana became a team, anticipating dangers, protecting the artifacts, and maintaining the cabin as a sanctuary. John realized that the danger had taught him more about responsibility, courage, and loyalty than any peaceful retreat ever could. By the end of the month, John had changed. He no longer thought of the cabin as just a cheap getaway. It had become a fortress of history, culture, and friendship. He had learned to trust Aiyana, respect her knowledge, and act decisively when needed. The danger that had first terrified him had transformed him, shaping him into someone capable of standing up for what mattered most. And yet, even with their preparations and careful planning, John knew that the forest held more secrets. and the people who had watched the cabin were not yet gone. The tension remained, a quiet reminder that the journey was far from over. But John felt ready. With Aiyana by his side, he understood that protecting the cabin and its treasures was more than a task. It was a calling, but he had entered the cabin seeking peace, but he had found purpose. He had entered seeking solitude, but he had found courage. And he had entered seeking a simple life, but he had found a story far greater than he could have imagined, one that connected him to the past, the land, and a woman whose strength would guide him through whatever challenges lay ahead. Bert. Weeks passed since the strangers had first approached the cabin, and John had grown more comfortable with his new life, though he remained vigilant. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow, and every rustle in the forest reminded him that the world beyond the cabin was not always safe. Yet through the tension he had learned patience, awareness, and trust. Desk. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Aiyana led John to a section of the basement he had never explored. It was hidden behind a false wall, carefully disguised so that no one would notice. "Brand, there is more to this place than even I knew at first," she explained. "The land has layers, and some secrets reveal themselves only when they are ready."
John's curiosity was immediately piqued.
Breaths. Together, they removed the wall, revealing a small chamber. It was dusty and dark, but the air inside seemed heavier, filled with an almost sacred energy. The room contained old scrolls, more carved artifacts, and some objects that glimmered faintly in the sunlight from the small basement window. John felt a shiver run down his spine. This was not just a cabin anymore. It was a repository of history, a hidden treasury of culture. Aiyana carefully pulled out one of the scrolls. The paper was old, almost fragile, and the writing was intricate. John could not read it, but he could feel the importance in every line. "These scrolls tell the story of my people," Aiyana said softly. "Not just my family, but all those who lived here before. They explain the land, its sacred places, and the responsibilities of those who protect it." John leaned closer, amazed by the care and precision in the writing. "John." Some scrolls contain maps of the forest, markings of hidden springs, and symbols indicating places of ceremonial importance. Others told stories of bravery, sacrifice, and survival. Every scroll seemed to connect to the artifacts they had already discovered, forming a larger picture that John was only beginning to understand. As they explored further, Aiyana revealed the truth about the artifacts themselves. Each object had a purpose. Some were meant to protect the land, others to honor ancestors, and a few held memories of events that could not be forgotten. John listened in awe as she explained that the artifacts were not just objects of value. They were guardians of history, imbued with meaning and responsibility.
John felt overwhelmed but inspired.
He realized that the cabin had been built on land with a story much larger than himself. He had thought he was buying a cheap, simple retreat, but now he understood that he had stepped into a legacy that demanded care, respect, and vigilance. That night, as the wind howled outside and snowflakes drifted past the windows, John and Aiyana sat by the fireplace. Aiyana spoke of the challenges her people had faced over centuries, how settlers, developers, and opportunists had often disregarded the land, trying to exploit it without understanding its significance. She told John that this cabin, this hidden chamber, and these artifacts were part of a network meant to preserve culture, memory, and respect for the land. John felt the weight of responsibility in a new way, Brett. He had already faced danger with the strangers, but now he understood why the artifacts mattered so much. This was not just about protecting physical objects. It was about honoring history, keeping stories alive, and maintaining the balance that had existed for generations. He realized that his role was far more important than he had imagined. The next day, John suggested they explore the surrounding forest further. Aiyana agreed. and together they walked quietly through the snow-covered trees, careful not to leave tracks. She pointed out landmarks and shared stories connected to each place. Some trees were centuries old, sacred in ways John could barely comprehend. Streams and small springs held significance, marking spots where ceremonies had been held or where important decisions were made long ago. As they moved deeper into the forest, John began to see the patterns Aiyana had described, symbols carved into trees, stones arranged in circles, and natural markers all seemed to form a map. Aiyana explained that these were guides left by her ancestors meant to help those who respected the land and its history. Patient, John was amazed by the foresight and wisdom of people he had never met, realizing that every detail had a purpose. When they returned to the cabin, John suggested cataloging the artifacts and scrolls to better understand them. Aiyana agreed, and they spent days organizing the objects, carefully noting details, markings, and stories. Each discovery revealed something new: messages from ancestors, instructions for protection, and insights into the traditions of the Apache people. John marveled at the depth and richness of it all.
During this time, Aiyana shared more personal stories.
She spoke of her family, of the challenges she had faced growing up, and of the responsibility she had inherited to protect the land. John listened, realizing that she carried not just a physical burden, but an emotional and cultural one as well. Her courage and wisdom inspired him, and he felt honored to be part of her mission. One evening, John found a small journal tucked inside a chest. It belonged to a previous guardian of the cabin, someone who had left detailed notes about the artifacts, the land, and threats from outsiders. Reading it, John discovered that the strangers who had approached the cabin were not the first to try to exploit it. Others had attempted to access the artifacts, but the land, the guardians, and careful planning had always protected them. The journal confirmed what Aiyana had been saying. The cabin was more than a home. It was a sanctuary. As the days passed, John began to notice changes in himself. He felt more connected to the land, more attuned to sounds, movements, and patterns he had once ignored. The forest, the cabin, and the artifacts were no longer distant or mysterious. They were part of his life. He had moved from being a curious visitor to an active protector. Aiyana also taught him about the importance of balance. Protecting the artifacts was not just about hiding them or guarding them. It was about understanding their purpose, respecting the traditions, and maintaining harmony between the past and present. John realized that the cabin, the forest, and the artifacts were all connected. Every action mattered, and even small decisions could have consequences. One afternoon, while organizing the hidden chamber, Aiyana showed John a final set of scrolls he had not seen before. These scrolls contained instructions for ensuring the long-term protection of the land and its artifacts. Some were written in code, others in symbols that required interpretation. Aiyana explained that she had waited for someone like John, someone patient, respectful, and willing to learn, to help her carry out this task. And John felt both honored and nervous. The responsibility was enormous, but he also knew he could not turn away. Over the next week, John and Aiyana began following the instructions in the scrolls. They reinforced hidden compartments, marked safe pathways in the forest, and recorded the locations of significant sites. Each day, John learned something new, not just about the land and artifacts, but about himself. He realized that courage was about more than facing danger. It was about responsibility, understanding, and care. As winter deepened, the cabin became a place of quiet reflection and preparation. John and Aiyana worked together, learning from each other and from the wisdom of the past. The tension from the strangers had not fully disappeared, but they felt more confident, prepared, and connected than ever before. The artifacts, the forest, and the cabin were no longer just objects and buildings. They were part of a living history, and John felt privileged to play a role in preserving it. One night, as the snow fell silently outside, John reflected on everything he had learned. The cabin that had seemed like a simple, cheap purchase was now a gateway to history, culture, and wisdom. He had come seeking peace, but he had found purpose, responsibility, and connection. Breathe. The artifacts and scrolls were no longer mysterious objects. They were teachers, guiding him to understand a world he had never known.
Aiyana sat beside him, watching the fire flicker.
"You have done well," she said softly. "But our work is not finished." The land, the artifacts, and the stories will always need guardians. That is why we must remain vigilant, careful, and respectful. John nodded, understanding the depth of her words. He realized that protecting the cabin and its treasures was more than a duty. It was a way of life, a commitment to history and culture, and a way to honor those who had come before. By the first time, he felt truly at peace, not because life was easy, but because he had found his purpose. And so, the cabin, once a simple dream, had transformed into a sanctuary of knowledge, history, and respect. John and Aiyana had uncovered its secrets, faced dangers, and discovered the profound meaning of the land. Together they had become guardians not just of artifacts but of stories, culture, and the enduring legacy of the people who had lived, loved, and protected this land for centuries. Winter had settled fully over the forest, and the cabin was now covered in a blanket of snow. The quiet outside seemed absolute, broken only by the occasional sound of a bird or the soft whisper of wind through the trees. John had grown accustomed to the rhythm of life here. Early mornings, long days of careful work, and evenings spent reading scrolls or sitting near the fireplace with Aiyana. But he knew that even this quiet was fragile. The events of the previous weeks had made it clear that the cabin and the artifacts were not just their responsibility. They were connected to something much larger. Aiyana had explained that the land itself seemed to choose its guardians. She had sensed that John had a kind heart and strong resolve, and now he understood why he had been brought here. It was not just chance, it was fate. One morning, as sunlight poured through the windows, John noticed tracks in the snow again. This time, however, the footprints were different. They seemed purposeful, not like the random wanderings of hikers or curious strangers.
John's heart sank.
He immediately called Aiyana, and together they moved silently to check the perimeter of the cabin. "They are here again," Aiyana said quietly, her voice steady but alert. "But this time, we are ready." John nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. They had spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment. Every door, every window, every hidden compartment had been reinforced. They had mapped escape routes in the forest, and John now knew the land almost as well as Aiyana. They were no longer passive. They were protectors. As the strangers approached, John and Aiyana stayed hidden, watching. The men were cautious, scanning the area, but they had clearly underestimated the cabin. They did not know the secret rooms, the hidden compartments, or the ways John and Aiyana could move silently through the forest. After a tense few minutes, the strangers grew frustrated and left, muttering under their breath. John exhaled slowly, feeling a mixture of relief and satisfaction. They had been tested, and they had passed. The next days were quieter, but John and Aiyana did not let their guard down. They continued organizing the artifacts, recording the locations of sacred spots, and studying the scrolls for any remaining secrets. John had learned to read some of the symbols, and he was beginning to understand the logic behind the arrangements of objects and markings. Each day brought new insight, and he felt more connected to the land, the cabin, and the people who had lived there before. One afternoon, Aiyana spoke of a decision that had been weighing on her for a long time. "The artifacts must not remain hidden forever," she said. "They are not meant to be forgotten. They must be shared carefully, with those who will respect them, so that the stories of my people survive." John looked at her thoughtfully. "Do you mean show them to the world?" he asked. "Not everyone," she said. "Only those who understand history, culture, and responsibility.
If the wrong people learn about them, they could be taken, misused, or destroyed.
But if we share them wisely, the artifacts can teach, inspire, and preserve our heritage.
John realized the truth in her words.
They had already faced danger from people who wanted to exploit the cabin. Sharing the artifacts was a risk, but it was also a way to honor the past. He felt ready to take that step. Together, they began making careful plans to contact local cultural preservation groups, historians, and authorities who could protect the artifacts and document the history. Over the next week, John and Aiyana met with a small team of experts who were fascinated by the cabin, the scrolls, and the artifacts. They listened carefully as Aiyana explained the history, traditions, and significance of each object. John watched as the experts took notes, photographed artifacts, and expressed deep respect for what they had uncovered. It was a relief to know that the artifacts were finally in safe hands, and that the history they represented would be preserved for future generations. The process of sharing the artifacts brought a sense of closure to John.
Breath. The cabin, which had once seemed like a simple purchase, had transformed into something far greater, a bridge between the past and present.
He realized that he had grown as a person, learning patience, responsibility, and the importance of protecting what is sacred.
He had faced fear, uncertainty, and danger, but he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected to the world around him. Even as the artifacts were carefully documented and preserved by the experts, John and Aiyana continued to care for the cabin and surrounding land. They knew that their work was ongoing. Protecting history and culture was not a one-time task. But they also felt a sense of accomplishment and peace. They had safeguarded the treasures, honored the traditions, and ensured that the stories of the land would survive. One evening, as the sun set behind the snow-covered mountains, John and Aiyana sat on the porch, drinking tea and watching the colors of the sky. The forest was quiet, almost serene, and for the first time in weeks, John felt completely at ease. He reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from a man seeking solitude to a guardian of history.
You've changed, Aiyana said softly. You are no longer just someone who bought a cabin.
You are part of this story now.
John smiled, feeling the truth in her words.
I never expected this, he admitted. I thought I was just looking for a quiet life. But I've learned more than I ever could have imagined. By courage, respect, and the importance of listening.
Aiyana nodded. The land teaches those who are willing to learn. And you have listened well.
As night fell, the stars appeared above the mountains, twinkling brightly in the clear sky. John felt a deep sense of connection to the land, to Aiyana, and to the history that had been preserved within the cabin. He realized that life was not about avoiding challenges or seeking only comfort. True meaning came from understanding, protecting, and honoring what is important. Over the following months, John and Aiyana continued their work, maintaining the cabin, guiding researchers, and protecting the sacred land. They shared stories with care, ensuring that the history of Aiyana's people was passed on with respect and integrity. The cabin had become more than a home. It was a sanctuary, a place of learning, reflection, and guardianship. John also noticed the changes within himself. He had grown stronger, more patient, and more aware of the world around him. He had faced fear, danger, and uncertainty, and he had emerged with wisdom and courage. The cabin had taught him lessons that no city, no book, and no ordinary life could have provided. One crisp winter morning, as sunlight danced across the snow, John walked through the forest with Aiyana. They paused at a sacred tree she had shown him long ago. He looked around, feeling the quiet power of the land, and realized how much he had come to love this place. It was no longer just a cabin. It was a home filled with history, meaning, and purpose. Aiyana placed a hand on his shoulder. The world will always change, she said. But if we remember the past and protect what matters, we can preserve what is valuable. You have helped me do that, John. Together, we have honored the land and the stories of my people. John nodded, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. He had come to the cabin seeking peace, but he had found something far more valuable: purpose, connection, and a chance to make a real difference. The cabin, the artifacts, and the forest were no longer simply objects and land. They were symbols of history, respect, and guardianship. As the sun dipped below the mountains, casting golden light over the snowy landscape, John understood that life had given him a rare gift. The journey that began with a simple purchase of a cheap cabin had transformed into a lifelong commitment to protect, learn, and honor. He felt gratitude for the trust Aiyana had placed in him and for the lessons the land had taught him. That night, as he sat by the fire, John realized something important. The cabin was not just a place. It was a story. A story of courage, culture, history, and friendship. A story that he had become a part of. And he knew, as he listened to the wind and watched the shadows dance across the walls, that this story would continue for generations, carried forward by those willing to protect and honor it. The cabin, once a cheap purchase and a simple dream, had become a symbol of something far greater than John could have imagined. It was a home, a sanctuary, and a bridge between the past and the present. And for John, it was a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected events lead to the most meaningful journeys. Breath. As winter settled deeper and the forest remained calm and quiet, John felt peace, not the kind that comes from avoiding the world, but the kind that comes from understanding it, respecting it, and protecting what is precious. The cabin, the artifacts, and the forest had taught him lessons that would stay with him forever. And in that understanding, he found true fulfillment.